Howdy, of you delicious people. I'm here today to not only review a Marvel movie, but then also to review a DC Comics movie. Simultaneously at the same time, ultimately, recently, it's probably a bad move because ultimately it's just like, well, normally I would probably do like, okay, a Marvel movie, and then do a DC comic book playlist movie and two different things. But I think I might also just branch off and just do okay. Here's a Ryan Reynolds movie playlist of any Ryan Reynolds movie because I had reviewed movies like The Captive and a lot of other things. So, and I don't think I'll stop there. I think I'll more than likely I'm kind of interested in reviewing because I had watched this at some point, but I want to watch it again. There had been this Ryan Reynolds movie called Paperman, which ultimately I want to check that out at some point, recheck it out because I ultimately had seen it before. Fairly interesting movie, and so I'm gonna go and check that out and probably review that at some point fairly soon. So letting you know, there's not a very easy and or convenient way to say that you saw the Deadpool movie. I think right now, to the current of the second this recording, Deadpool, if you could go through uh, Amazon, more than likely it'll probably tell you that it's on the FX app thing, which ultimately, getting into that will probably tell you that it's you need some network or something like that to ultimately go into that, or it's not a just easy or convenient way to see any of these. I probably would have gone out of my way to at some point recommended that app because ultimately I would have wanted to have seen the new Flatliners movie, and I think that was on that app as well. Yeah, I think I started the new Flatliners movie, but then I kind of just gave up and just did other things. So eventually, I want to go back into eventually watching that movie, but I'm not quite sure if it's going to be uh like I don't know if it's gonna be like something that I'm eventually going to go out of my way to watch, unless there's nothing else on my list of stuff that I want to get to because there's a lot of other stuff I want to get to as well. Plus, we're starting to get into October fairly soon, so gonna have to start watching some slasher films and some horror films. Funny enough, kind of both of these movies kind of break down in a horror kind of way, some ways or another. So let's ultimately let you know you can ultimately go on HBO Max. If you already have HBO Max, you can in fact watch Green Lantern, the Green Lantern movie. Ultimately, you could also go into probably just bootlegging, finding some variation of this movie somewhere and watch it for free. Yeah, ultimately just trying to figure out some way to ultimately say, yeah, you could probably watch these movies somewhere if you ultimately have a movie box app or something like that to watch these movies for basically free. Because ultimately, the one movie might hold up and one movie maybe not so well. Who knows? So let's go into talking about Deadpool. Ultimately, we're going to talk about both these movies in a very cryptic like sense, give you a double five time count, and then ultimately go into spoilers about each one of these movies. At the end of the day, if you want to be completely avoid of either one of these spoilers of each one of these movies, once I do the double five time count and then go into spoilers, ultimately, I will be shifting camera screen scenarios. So ultimately, you can fast forward to the point of ultimately going into me talking about Green Lantern in a very cryptic like sense by me shifting camera. So you can be completely avoid of either one of these spoilers and just kind of get my consensus on how I felt about both these movies. But ultimately, these movies have been out for a very long time, and as I rhyme my way through this, more than likely you'll probably just want to hear the spoiler versions anyways, because you'll just maybe just enjoy what I have to say. So, Deadpool. Ultimately, the very first beginning of this movie, I did not remember how it began. Like I was just like, how did this movie begin? I don't remember. And so when going to this movie, I'm like, oh, this is how this begins. Okay, interesting. Going into this movie, I thought it was really fairly odd how they had a very choppy origin story. It was like it was two scenes going back and forward. We have like an action scene as well as an origin story scene, I guess, to really keep the momentum of this movie, to just be like, yeah, but it's going to be like an action packed movie and it's going to go, 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 go. It's not going to be a slow film at any point in juncture. So going into this movie, I really still think all of the jokes still land. I think the movie is still funny. If anything, there probably still are jokes that at some point in time aren't as funny, just because reasonably they are the stuff that you saw in the trailers or the stuff that you know is coming. And so reasonably, like, because you'd seen it like a billion times before you even got into the movie. Um, like the whole avocado joke just really doesn't land anymore, just because you've seen it a million times before you even got into the movie. So going into this, yeah, movie's still funny. I think it's still a hilarious film. Going into this, the only thing that I think is just weaker through both Daredevil film or Daredevil. Now I'm gonna get some malarkey. Hey, yeah, Daredevil. That. Maybe I should review the Daredevil film. Just to see Colin Farrell as Bullseye one more time. Can I have some peanuts? Yeah. Anyways, so because that's the only, I think that's the only like thing that one person that I know ends up uh like uh telling me about that movie whenever I'd watch it, or like, can I have some peanuts? And so yeah, going into this movie, the jokes still land, things are still funny, and reasonably it's still is good, except for the weakest part, of course, is the villain, where it just feels like they could have just tossed any villain in here and it still would have been well. But it ultimately seems like the whole like journey that Ryan Reynolds' character has to go into is, or Wade characters has to go into, kind of feels pointless, because it's like Wade is not really going up against a real true like menacing character that we all know, like, oh my god, this character is like, whoo, yeah, high level character. Like reasonably, like I think a lot of people would go into like the Deadpool video game and see Mr. Sinister as the big bad, if ultimately you haven't seen that video game yet. And I had played all the way through it a couple times, really enjoy it. Big thumbs up for the game. Hopefully, eventually, we'll get a sequel somewhere down a millennial pipeline, with Nolan North hopefully still effing alive so he can do the voice. Because Ryan Reynolds doesn't want to do the voice of the game. He would rather have Nolan North do it, because he's the voice of Deadpool. So, going into this, yeah, still very much the weakest point is probably having Ajax in this movie, and it's just, to me, it's the weakest point. Also, going into this movie, I think it's just odd to have Colossus in this film. That's not a big spoiler. Reasonably, if you see the trailer, you know Colossus is in this film. So yeah, just kind of going through this film, those are probably the two weakest points. Uh, just because it kind of feels like this story doesn't really quite have a story, or it doesn't feel like a story that's strong enough, to where they kind of have to like put in these put in these characters to try and add to a story, uh, that is kind of like these filler moments, at some points in time. I think in the sequel, I think they kind of do the same thing, but they kind of do a lot of things better. They make for a lot more um, like fast paced things going on. Um, there's a lot more characters that ultimately you could really find hilarious. And again, I think there's a lot better um, approaches to things at some point. Knowing full well that I had reviewed Deadpool 2, I think at some point it would probably even be better if I went in and re-reviewed Deadpool 2. Uh, just to ultimately look back on it and to just be like, does this movie still hold up? Is it even better than my original thoughts? And this and that. So I think Deadpool 2 is a great movie. It's great. So, but yeah. So, like, those are kind of my hangups about Deadpool 1, if anything. But looking back on it, like, it didn't matter that Deadpool had. Like, Deadpool could easily sell this to you, like, by himself. He didn't really need to have a villain, he didn't need to have guest appearances. He could have had an whole entire movie done by himself, and the movie really would have sold well. Especially considering Fox, I don't think didn't have enough faith in this movie whatsoever, to the point where Ryan Reynolds had to forcibly go into aggressive negotiations to get this movie done, because ultimately he was promised this movie when he was doing Wolverine Origins. He was promised this movie, and so he was like, I want to do this movie now. You guys promised this to me a long time ago, because reasonably he didn't want, like, he didn't like doing the Deadpool that they were doing in Wolverine Origins. Spoiler for a movie that's been out for a very long time, but yeah, he didn't like that movie. He didn't like how they were doing Deadpool in that movie. He was like, dude, we're not sticking to the comic books at all. We're just reinventing the character. This isn't right. And a lot of people just told him um, to hush about it. And ultimately, like, if people like this movie, then eventually they're going to do a Deadpool movie. And so immediately he had to wait a very long time to ultimately tell a origin story that has forcibly no ties to otherwise the Wolverine Origins movie, but eventually, again, he kind of jokingly throws in some jokes about Wolverine Origins, and or even mentions Wolverine in this movie. So, yeah. So I think it's about that time to go into spoilers about this film. Ultimately, at the end of the day, probably a lot of people have probably seen this movie, even though it's rated R by and large. So let's get into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this movie. So, Deadpool. Deadpoolio. Can't believe I'm actually going into spoilers about this movie or even reviewing this film, because I'm like, I reviewed the second film and I didn't think of anything of it, and I was like, you know what, like, I should actually talk about the first Deadpool movie. But then I was like, nah, maybe I shouldn't. But then I'm like, you know what, F it. Like, I want to rewatch this film again because I think I forgot about more things than I remember. So, spoiler time now. The very beginning of this movie, we have it to where immediately, like, we start this movie with Deadpool in a cab, and I was like, okay, this is a very odd way to open this movie. We ultimately have Deadpool talking to, I believe his name is Dehinder. I believe I'm going to butcher that name. And so immediately we have the kind of starting off within this movie with the consistent cab ride with, I believe his name is Dehinder. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. Um, and I really hope that through every single Deadpool movie, we keep going into this cab ride. And either that, or if they do something really off the wild and weird cuff in Deadpool 3, I hope eventually we get back to that cab, or maybe another cab driver, something like that. So we eventually get Deadpool talking to Dehinder about his girlfriend woes and stuff like that. So eventually, he wants him to kind of take matters into his own hands. So Eventually, we have Deadpool getting out of the car and eventually uh, just holding up onto this bridge. That's where we get the salt and pepper shoop shoop, and then eventually he is drawing, and so eventually he drops onto this moving vehicle. Eventually he starts beating up people, and eventually here's where we get the flying of jokes. And so he starts beating up all these people, going, "Oh, rich Corinthian leather," and ultimately beating up one guy and says, "Have you seen this man?" and all of these jokes start flying within these seconds of film. All of these weird and interesting like things, but he's killing all these people in this car till eventually the car flips over and he pops out of the moonroof, ultimately saying, Did I leave the oven on?" And so car flips over, letting us know that he does not give a crap about nothing. And so basically we get to the point to where eventually, considering Deadpool consistently leaves his his bullets and everything like that he uses to go and kill people with, he always usually leaves all those bags in his taxis or somewhere. He leaves them at home. So eventually he has to decide to just use whatever he has with him, which is usually just 12 bullets or two swords or whatever he has. So eventually he has to count out exactly how many bullets he has to kill people. And funny enough, there's plenty of times where motorcycle guys are coming in or other people are kind of coming in, and of course he loses shots and stuff like that. So cue us eventually randomly having to intermittently through this fight, ending up having to pause through these fights to ultimately go back into Deadpool's origin story. So now we find out that Deadpool ended up taking a contract from some girl and ended up needed to tell his stalker to go away. So immediately there's a guy answering a door for a pizza, and it's a pizza he didn't order, but Ryan ends up walking into this apartment that this guy didn't know he was even home, or that Ryan was even home, to get this pizza. And so immediately we have Ryan grabbing the guy in this apartment building and chucking him around. And then eventually, so this guy is thinking that Ryan is after him, that he's going to kill him, and Ryan tells him no. Like, no, I'm not going to go after you. And do whatever I like. He kind of has to like very very generically, like kind of threaten this guy and tell him it's like, or I'll do something to your cat. And he's like, dude, I don't have a cat. And he's like, well, hey, uh, what cat litter did I shit in? And so we ultimately have it to where we find out that the culprit isn't actually the guy that ordered the pizza, it's the pizza man himself. So Ryan grabs the pizza man and tells him, hey, this girl sent me for you to tell her to leave her alone. Like, I know you're doing some light stalking on her. Cut that crap out, or I'm going to come back for you. So Ryan scares the life out of this pizza guy and eventually goes back to the girl to to let her know that the job is resolved. So eventually Ryan heads to his bar that is ushered by I think it's like TJ Miller. I'm probably saying that probably incorrectly. The stand up comedian, I think, probably CJ, TJ. I'm pronouncing that probably wrong. He plays the character Weasel. So immediately Ryan asks for, or let's call him Wade. Wade asks for a BJ drink, to ultimately give to one of the guys, and tells the person to tell it's from some other guy in the bar. So the one of the guys gets a drink and ultimately is told that it's from some other person. So this guy goes and has a bar fight with said person, beats the living crap out of him, and ultimately Weasel goes to check on this guy and realize that he's still alive. And ultimately he yells out, "Hey, yeah, this guy's still alive, folks." And they're like, "Ah!" And ultimately they realize that they're putting a Deadpool together on everyone at the bar to ultimately see who's going to kill who today. Ultimately, Wade ultimately had a a bid on that guy, and he had lost. So we ultimately have it to where uh, it gets to the juncture of we start to find all of these characters at the bar. Eventually, we find this woman uh, that makes her way to this bar, and eventually one of the bar patrons grabs this woman on the butt, and basically Wade's character tells him, "Oh, you shouldn't have done that." And so this girl grabs this other bar patron by the huevos and starts crushing his huevos, and calls him Fat Gandalf, and to the point where eventually she tries to hurt him so much so that way he will never do that again. So eventually we are to have Wade kind of ask this woman of the night, obviously, because this girl is evidently a woman that gets paid for her work. So he basically tells her, "Hey, how much is X amount of money and a yogurt gift card? How much time is that going to do me?" And she's like, 45 minutes of what the hell you want. So, but basically they go into this back and forth about who had the worst home. Eventually, to some point where uh, they talked about how they were like supposedly like abused as children and stuff like that, and how like, but one of them is talking about like, "Oh, you had a home, like I lived in a box," and like it gets worse and worse and worse, but it keeps getting hilarious to ultimately see who's going to win at the end of it, who can come with a worser story. So eventually, cue us having Wade and this girl eventually just. She has 45 minutes with Wade, so ultimately he decides to win her over by having them both play skee ball, to the point where eventually they get a crap ton of tickets, and then eventually he gets this Voltron like ring. So ultimately, instead of just going right into the business, he kind of sweetens her up by just having them go on a date, which ultimately leads them into the bedroom business, and they decide that, hey, maybe we should just have this bedroom business all year round, uh, accumulating them having to do every single holiday, Valentine's Day, Christmas, and everything in between. And so they lead off with Christmas and eventually have it to where um, they're both wearing ugly sweaters, and so eventually this is such an odd exchange of just year-round odd things going on. I find it hilarious. And so eventually we have Ryan's character that is eventually going into round two, after he goes to the bathroom, and but then he ends up going whoa, and then he falls over. Hence, we go and have him go to the hospital, and we find out that there is cancer basically all over his body, and so now he has to figure out a way of treatment for said cancer, and so he eventually leaves. He eventually just leaves his girl to go and get treatment, which he honestly thinks it's a waste because basically the cancer is everywhere. So he's going to get treatment, but recently it's just like it's a non-winning battle, and he doesn't want to see. He doesn't want her to be there watching him wither away. And so ultimately, he goes into a bar at some point, and there's some guy looking for him that is this men in black, black suited man. And ultimately says, hey, like, I'm working with this facility that ultimately is in the business of making people superheroes. And like, hey, whatever your ailment is right now, we're willing to be able to cure all of that by having you come with us. So, reasonably considering Wade has absolutely nowhere to turn, he eventually, after one night of bliss with his wife, he eventually kind of walks out on her and ultimately calls the number to uh, sign up for this for these experimental treatments. Hilariously, he meets the guy again to be put into this doctor's bed. Immediately, ultimately mentioning that, hey, if you're going to make me a superhero, don't make the super suit green or animated. Referencing to a certain kind of movie that we've probably heard at some point in time. Anyways, so we have to where we find out that this treatment isn't happy go lucky and whatever. We find out this entire treatment is basically having to have Wade being tortured over and over and over, and you get the point, until eventually his powers unleash or unlock, and basically that's what they think that they could be able to do to figure out how to unlock this person's mutant gene. And so basically we have Ryan, who is meeting this guy named Ajax, and ultimately he is the guy that is going to be performing repetitiously this torture on Wade's character. So eventually Ajax comes in and he tells him what is to go on, and eventually Ryan tells him, "Hey, you have really just something in your teeth." Of course, he actually goes and looks for it, and Ryan says, "Oh my God, like you actually looked for it." And so eventually, uh, we have it to where like it seems like he's ragging on everybody. He's calling the girl that is with Ajax like the more angry Rosie O'Donnell because she is consistently punching him in the face or just beating the crap out of him. And ultimately, we find out that this girl has like superhuman strength. Or Ajax has very much, like I think his thing is much more like reflexes and stuff like that, and in that he doesn't feel pain at all because he had been tortured so much that I think nerves were severed, and he doesn't feel pain. So eventually, we get to the aspect of Wade talking to one of the other patients about his bucket list on basically them like trying to like figure out what is their things that they want to get off their bucket list. And and this and that, coming up with all these things. And so eventually it gets to the point to where Wade tells Ajax that he's like, hey, I figured out what your name is. Like, I figured it out that it's Francis. Because ultimately I had stolen one of your things off of one of your dry cleaning. I figured it out. I figured out what your name is. And so immediately Francis doesn't like that he figured out what his name was. And so basically he tells him, it's like, you know what, I'm going to make your life so much more worse. And Ryan ultimately tells him, it's like, dude, there's no way you can do that. It's like, the perfect thing about round the clock torture is there's no way to step it up from that. And so Ajax immediately says, well, I think I can come up with that. So he eventually puts him in some bizarrish looking tank like thing that ultimately Francis breaks it down and ultimately tells him it's like it's an adjustment of air. Where ultimately, if um, Ryan is getting just enough oxygen, like they lower it down. If its heart rate goes to a certain thing, they keep adjusting everything into this big old tank thing, tube tank esh like thing, to make it to where this guy is consistently suffocating, but ultimately he's suffocating alive to where ultimately if it seems like he's almost going to die, they try to revive him. So it's like this consistent, like he's barely getting just enough air to stay alive. So this guy goes into this thing and basically uh, Wade's character ends up taking off angrier Rosie O'Donnell. And so basically he it gets to the point where she like headbutts him or something like that. And so eventually Francis is consistently going to Wade and asking him, hey, what's my name? Fearing what response that he'll get. And of course, he gets nothing. But again, Wade, of course, tells him, it's like, you really have something in your teeth now, because he had just been scarfing down some broccoli. So they end up putting him in this tube thing and leaving him in there for the weekend, and or supposedly for the weekend. So eventually we get it to where Wade eventually his entire body completely changes and into very much being transformed into the Deadpool that we know him to be. So eventually we come back to this, and eventually Wade is to be almost permanently left into this tank tube esh like thing, to where eventually he lights a match into this tube and explodes this entire thing, and then escapes via this entire facility burning down, to the point where he goes and fights Ajax, but he loses. So reasonably, like, the entire facility burns down, but Wade is still alive to um, get his dead body out of this and ultimately go into uh, re-finding his girl. So cue us having Deadpool now fighting off all of these henchmen. He has two swords inside of one guy that seems to that he is very much mutant, and so Deadpool is trying to slice and dice this one mutant man back to where the cars were flipping over, and he was mentioning how he didn't remember if he had the oven on or not. And so eventually the car flips over, and now he's fighting all the men. He's running out of bullets. And so eventually we have Ajax driving his motorcycle uh, into this scenario. It eventually gets to where Wade grabs him, puts a sword into him, and keeps him on this bridge. And then eventually keeps throwing rocks at him, or kicking the sword to where it like dangles within his body, yada yada yada. So we end up having by proxy Colossus hearing about Wade killing people on this bridge. So immediately he is grabbing Negasonic Teenage Warhead, which is a very long name to say, and telling her, oh, okay, hey, you and me have to uh, go and meet Wade. And so immediately, like we have the Sinead O'Connor as like Negasonic Teenage Warhead going into meeting Wade. So we have it to where Colossus drops in and immediately uh, is trying to convince Deadpool to join the X-Men because it seems like that's what he's trying to do. Is he's trying to prevent Deadpool from killing a bunch of people, and he thinks that if he could have Deadpool join the X-Men, maybe he'll kill less people, and then ultimately he will be a better man for it. And so immediately, as guys all around are just starting to drop out of nowhere, and he's like, "Oh no, those people were already dead," and this and that, trying to convincingly, like, say that he didn't kill all of these people, to Colossus, that ultimately is gonna be very ticked off about him. So funny enough, how like Deadpool was talking to Wade, and then all of a sudden was reaching out his hand, and ultimately was like feeling around, and he's like, "Dad," and then he confronts Colossus and starts talking to him, and then eventually, while he's talking to Colossus, and Colossus is trying to get him on the X-Men side and try to talk him into joining the X-Men, and Deadpool wants nothing to do with it. Eventually, Negasonic makes him aware that Francis had escaped. And so Wade is severely frustrated um, that Colossus distracted him uh, for his villain to escape. So immediately he's tired of Colossus, so he just starts fighting with Colossus. Immediately he tries to punch Colossus, breaks his hand, tries to punch Colossus in the junk, and he breaks his hand, and he's like, man, your poor wife. And then he freaking tries to like uh, kick him in the face and breaks his leg. Freaking Negasonic is laughing. And so basically, like, Deadpool is hobbling around saying, hey, how about like a one man kicking ass contest? And so, like, immediately Deadpool tries to kick Colossus again, and again breaks his other leg. So it's the most hilarious part of the entire movie, where we have Deadpool, who is basically defyingly just trying to kick a guy that is, or trying to beat the crap out of a guy that is not in his weight class. So we just have Colossus eventually handcuffing himself to Deadpool and just telling him like, "Hey, like, you'll love being with the X-Men. Believe me, it'll be fun for you." And Deadpool is just like, you know what? No, no, I'm not gonna do that. So eventually he cuts his own hand off, and Negasonic is realizing this, and she's like, "Oh my god!" And so eventually, Deadpool uh, hops over the bridge onto a dumpster truck full of trash, and Colossus grabs the handcuffed part of Deadpool, and it's the hand still giving him the finger. Cue us going all the way to us getting to the garbage man dropping Deadpool off, because immediately we've covered pretty much all of the origin stuff to this point, telling us what had all happened. So we covered all the origin stuff. Now we're going into real time, and it's completely fine. So we immediately have Deadpool go into this apartment that he's currently staying in with a woman that is blind, that is putting together severely difficult IKEA furniture. And to the point where he comes in there and he has to put on his beef jerkin shoes, his Crocs. They're ultimately perfect for him jerking it, I guess, for reasons. So immediately he goes into uh, him trying to cover up this hand that is eventually starting to heal and become a much more, at first, baby hand, but then eventually growing into a real actual hand. So we get some kind of back and forth between him and this woman about this furniture, and basically us kind of understanding this old woman and why she's even there, and at some points him having like blind jokes and stuff like that being put into this thing here. So eventually cue us eventually going into us having to reconfirm Wade's kind of status going on into the world, eventually having him go and meet Weasel again and showcase his head of lettuce. So he meets up with Wade again and ultimately shows him his head, and of course he makes the joke of the avocado joke, where it's like, hey, your head looks like uh, a young avocado having sex with a much older avocado, and it was like it really wasn't a good it really wasn't a good time. It was just like really like it was a real hate session and real hate like going into that. And he's like, you know what, I get it. Like I get it. And so immediately like we break down that Deadpool wants to get back at Francis, so uh so ultimately they have to come up uh, with the name of our said character, also his costume and everything like that. Also, like backtracking a little bit um, to again the origins of Deadpool, because I guess we have to go back to that point. Him at first having to wear white, but then eventually him realizing how much blood that creates. Because again, we're kind of backpedaling a little bit and then going into the full origin of everything. Him going from white to then a red suit, and then eventually him shooting all these people down to try to get to the guy that had given him the 555 number. Him eventually killing that guy and trying to get information about Francis, and then us leading to us getting Wade back to showcasing his head to Weasel, and then eventually them coming up with his name, and eventually coming up with what to do next is to try to get Wade to find his woman, because eventually Francis goes into Weasel's bar and looks for Deadpool, and eventually gets a picture of his woman, and eventually he is there to track down his woman. But so Wade goes into this strip club and eventually tries to get the muster up the ability to see his woman with his face like that again. And so recently he is having a tough time getting to her, and so ultimately we have it to where somebody is looking um for Wade's girlfriend, and so she goes into this back alley, and she naturally assumes that the person looking for her is Wade, and it actually is Ajax. So Ajax takes her and steals her away, and ultimately Wade is shortly there behind to try and get to the muster of talking to her, but she vanishes, of course, because Ajax has her. So we now have to have Wade go and fight Francis one last time. So eventually he is um, putting all these guns together. He's ultimately trying to uh, go to Colossus and ask for his help, because ultimately he is telling him, hey, like, if you help me out with this, I will join your boy band. I will join your boy band. Like I will like I will join whatever. I'll join you. I'll join you in the X-Men. Yeah, either Patrick Stewart or James McAvoy, whoever it is, because these timelines are confusing. And I know that joke was earlier in the movie, but F it, I'm gonna reuse it now. So we go into uh, ultimately having Colossus, Negasonic, and Deadpool going through this taxi heading to this place where Francis is at. So we ultimately find out that Dohinder had threw threw a guy in his trunk and is now keeping him from hostage, because ultimately the the love that Dohinder had been looking at some other guy, and so immediately he had kidnapped said guy, and basically Wade is basically like, oh my god, great on you, but then ultimately looking at Colossus is like, oh yeah, like, well, we are in the midst of okay, so he's like, yeah, you shouldn't have done that, good on you. Like you should go to this woman, kidnap her, and like and like all of this stuff. He's like kind of under his breath telling him what actually to do, and in all hilarity, and it's a very funny scene. I really love this scene the most, um, out of having like Deadpool trying to be this good guy when realizing that like he wants to also kind of cryptically talk to Dohinder and kind of like tell him what to do next. So eventually we get out of this car, and then we realize that Deadpool had left again all the bullets into the cab, and so he eventually is trying to call the cab back, but he gets into an accident, so that doesn't work out. So they decide, okay, well, let's just go with what we have. So all of a sudden we have DMX, Blazing X, gonna give it to you, and freaking they're walking out. So we have Francis again, who is shouting out, hey, what's my name? And Deadpool's like, oh yeah, I'm gonna spell it out to you. I'm gonna spell it out to you. So we ultimately have the girl that she's with, that ultimately she is on The Mandalorian. She plays in The Mandalorian. She's also in a number of other movies that I at some point saw. I think she was in a Kellen Lutz movie at some point. But moot point. So she, of course, is this super strong Ash-like character, and she does the superhero landing, and Deadpool has to mention she does the superhero landing, but it's bad on the knees, but everyone does it. So she drops, and eventually Deadpool mentions it's like, oh, hey, well, good that you're here because, um, like, that's why I brought him. And so immediately Colossus is like, you know what, I don't want to hit women, and you know what, I just don't want to fight you. And so immediately this girl like punches the crap out of Colossus to where he goes flying. And so Deadpool ultimately says it's like, well, no, that's the reason why I brought her. And so we have Negasonic Teenage Warhead, who is ultimately sending a text, and immediately Deadpool is like, "Oh, you're sending a tweet? Make sure you hashtag it." And then she just throws away the phone and then just attacks this girl and takes her down. And so immediately that's when all the other henchmen swarm in, and Deadpool is taking them all down, eventually slicing and dicing them all. But then eventually he's going into one of the people that he met on TJI Fridays and like, hey, how are things? And then he punches him in the face, knocks him down. He's like, oh, hey, how's the wife? How's the kids? So eventually we get to the point to where Deadpool takes out every single one of these guards, and then spells out the name Francis on this street sign. And so Deadpool yells out, "Hey, I this is your name," and it's just Francis, and Francis is just like, ah. So Colossus is fighting Ajax, second in command, and there's this like back and forth. It gets to the point to where eventually, uh, for the most point, the superhuman girl has a real, like, she's beating the crap out of Colossus a lot, and ultimately, like, he's knocking her away, and that eventually, uh, she gets to where one of her, she gets a wardrobe malfunction. He has to mention to her, it's like, well, hey, you're very pretty, but hey, you're popping out there. So she's like, oh wow, how nice of you to mention that. And so she takes herself and then beats the crap out of him again. But eventually, at some point, gets the upper hand. Eventually, takes him down. So eventually, Negasonic ends up catapulting Deadpool onto this ship that Ajax is on. So eventually, Wade realizes that his girlfriend is in the same tank that he was in to turn into his mutant Wade Pool. And so eventually they start the machine, but they put a sword through that machine to just kind of poke a hole through it. And so eventually we get it to where this big fight out between Ajax and Wade goes into it. And eventually they keep fighting, and so it gets to the point to where they keep fighting it out, and at some point, I'm not quite sure exactly where this all ties at some point, or where everything all happens, but um, we we get to the point to where, okay, we Wade and Deadpool all fight it out, and eventually at some point, uh, Wade gets a upper hand on Ajax and basically tells him, like, okay, you're gonna fix this butterface. And Ajax tells him, it's like, dude, do you think I had a cure for you? Like, no, like, there wasn't anything like that. Like, ultimately, Ajax was consistently saying that he had a cure for him, so that way Wade would always keep Ajax alive. And so to where eventually, uh Wade holds a gun to Wade holds a gun to Ajax. And I say there's a point of time of which I forget exactly what happens, because at some point I think the frigate or whatever that they're on eventually tips all over, and all this stuff starts falling off of out of all of this stuff to a point to where Wade ultimately is holding on to um, Wade's girlfriend, and it all tips over, and he's putting her in, re-putting her in that tank thing that he was in an early portion of the film, and all tips over, and eventually everything falls out of the ship, and so eventually we all land on the one end of this, but I don't remember where that happens, but it happens somewhere in this movie. I don't remember where exactly it happens, but it happens. So we ultimately have we ultimately have Wade holding a gun to Ajax, and Colossus is telling him, "Wait, like Wade, there's 4 or 5 moments of being a good person, and like reasonably, you need to realize that at some points you need to at some point like forgive someone and let things go and this and that, and then Wade just shoots Ajax and kills him. And it's like, well, yeah, I guess I'll find those other 4 moments somewhere else. And so immediately it's just like, well, okay, sure. So we get to the point to where we unlock the girl out of the tank, and so eventually we get to the point to where okay, the girl has to unmask Wade, and he has the face of Hugh Jackman uh, over his face as a joke, and then she takes the Hugh Jackman thing off, like he had a backup mask if that mask fell off. So he takes the she takes the Hugh Jackman mask off, and so she realizes it's like, well, hey, that's not really that bad. It's like if anything, we're gonna need a massive amount of drinks, but hey, like this isn't that bad. And so eventually they re-up, have that moment of talking about their worst homes and everything like that. But ultimately, at some points in time, she basically says that he wins the competition because he definitely has had like the worst life or whatever. So he wins. So leading us to have that good old moment, and basically not realizing that Colossus and Negasonic are still there. He's like, dude, you guys are still there? Like, and so immediately they start leaving. And of course, again, for Deadpool, he has to. There was some times where he was talking about, like, hilariously enough, talk about Negasonic Teenage Warhead as like Sigourney Weaver from Aliens 3, or Sinead O'Connor, Nothing Compares to You. He had to keep throwing that joke out there all the time. And so immediately he throws one more joke out at her, and she's like, well, it's okay that you gave me this joke because hey, you're still cool. And he's like, oh my god, is that like a nice you said something nice to me? Because ultimately he was mentioning before on how like he knew her and how she was either going to say some rude comment or like snort of derision or something like that, and so he was just kind of waiting um, for what she was going to do. Like it was either going to be a rude comment or dead silence, and so immediately he was waiting for a response, and she didn't say anything. So he's like, "Aha! Like I got you," and so yeah, because he was talking about like hilariously some generational gap where it's like, oh, you girls are all the same. You and you're flipping your hair back and and this and that. like you girls are all the same and this and that. So it goes into like the rude comment or the dead silence, and like he got to her. So it's like, aha. He's like, because she ultimately says, oh, yeah, I got nothing, and he's like, aha, I got you. So yeah, um, basically ended off at there, and that's really just how the movie just ends, with like them kissing it out, and then just that's eventually just how the movie ends, with just like woohoo, yeah, we won. So yeah, that's how Deadpool ultimately ends, and I didn't realize I was going to spend an hour talking about Deadpool. So let's move on. Green Lantern. In a very cryptic like sense, Green Lantern ultimately is a movie that doesn't really quite hold up. Ultimately, really doesn't quite hold up. When looking at this movie, I saw it and I was like, man, this movie is rough. This movie is rough. A lot of times it's like it's freaking glad handing the stars of the movie, the real, true, legitimate, like big stars of the film, Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds, like basically just waxing their butt through a bulk of this film, and basically saying how like great Ryan Reynolds and Blake Lively's characters are through other characters and this and that. And reasonably, the weakest part of this movie is as well, you have a very weak villain that ultimately, not only a weak villain, but then also another villain that is basically a big old CGI'd ish like character. Ultimately, there's a lot of problems of which that I have with this movie that I ultimately do hate. Just because immediately when going to this movie, I've seen animated movies where you would have early Green Lantern characters, and they would get trained a lot better, and ultimately they would have a whole training esh like sequence. But everything seems to be really rushed for Hal's character just because film. And but immediately I've seen way better attempts at really training a rookie Green Lantern, because recently this character doesn't really get all that trained at all, to the point to where how he can just, I guess, it's like the training is just easy and quick. Oh yeah, just do constructs and then go and save your world. Um, yeah. Uh, ultimately, I ultimately every single Green Lantern animated movie is really great. I really love those. I really enjoyed the Green Lantern animated series. I thought that that was really great because ultimately we get into Red Lanterns into that. So I love all those. I know I love Emerald Knight, and I think the one that came previously before that. I love all those, even though a lot of the times within those movies, it kind of branches off into other Green Lantern-esque like characters, so you get to know the mythos of some other characters besides Hal, but still becomes a very intriguing movie, and I still enjoy it much more compared to this movie. So if there is a point of which that this movie doesn't do it for you, because it probably doesn't, then at the end of the day, every single animated Green Lantern thing is way better, I believe, than actually the movie itself. It just, that is what it is. So ultimately, yeah, this movie is. There's some interesting things that it tries to do, but when looking at it, it kind of takes too long for an origin movie to get through its origin. I honestly think that Hal Jordan's origin should be just something you should briefly kind of comb over. But I think it takes way too effing long to really get into the actual Green Lantern actual parts. Like, I think it takes us like an hour to finally actually get him on Oa and actually on the and actually like Green Lantern training and legitimately having the suit and ba 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 ba. It takes too freaking long into this movie to comb over so many less important things. And reasonably, once we get it, like I would really just fast forward through this movie, past probably around the first hour to where they actually get to Oa, and like, because I think everything else doesn't really need that importance. They spend too long on an origin story that didn't need to take too long to do, and reasonably, basically, they recycle lines that previous people have used to just be like Hal's mantra of just with great power comes great responsibility. Like, that's basically like what they do with Hal in this movie. There's a lot of stuff that I really think kind of pushes story, but then again, just becomes like, why do they have to do all of this? Um, did they just need to have like a lot of people in one room all at once to have like a big party or a big this or a big that? Like everything else doesn't really matter to me or doesn't really care. All that matters is when eventually Hal is going to get to Oa. That should have been the biggest part of this movie, and instead, it doesn't really feel like it has significance. Like I think Hal immediately once we get like this whole entire movie should have started off with Hal getting the ring. How Ab and Sora ended up getting hurt, eventually giving the ring to Hal, and then Hal going to Oa. That should have been a big bulk of all this movie, but I guess reasonably they didn't want to spend that much amount of money on the special effects. And for what special effects they did have, now just kind of look really just cringe. And like a lot of the stuff that they did do, like the whole thing building up Parallax in this movie just seemed like a waste of time. You could have just had this guy magically appear out of nowhere and just had a quick thing about him instead of having to um, build up so much mystery about this character where there's some references where we have to be told, yeah, he's taking down a lot of the things that Sinestro has to kind of tell us and this and that. So it's a very rough movie, and there's stuff that I'm like, man, we should have savored and spent more time on. I don't really understand why we had to spend so much time uh, rekindling a relationship between Ryan Reynolds' character and Blake Lively when we kind of knew that Ryan was going to eventually re-win this character over regardless. Immediately, basically, we could have just had it to where Blake Lively's character was thrown in the middle of some kind of uh, like part against Parallax, and he could have gone and saved her, and like that's like they didn't need to spend so much time on this relationship, and they didn't really need to spend so much time on letting us know that Hal's character um is of course like afraid of what he's doing. Immediately they could have done that convincingly when we get to Oa. Again, I think a lot of it was just budget kind of things because as far as DC movies goes, most of these things don't have a budget or are the special effects just kind of at a lot of points kind of laughable just because it's a DC film. Ultimately, this isn't like this is kind of a bad DC movie, but when looking at it, there are probably movies that are just as equally bad, if not unwatchable, just because they are god awful. AKA Justice League, AKA a number of DC films that I could probably plop my way through mentioning here that I don't like. And I don't care about Snyder cuts. I don't care about like there might be a lot of saving graces for some movies and stuff like that, but when looking at it, it's just like I think Green Lantern is probably a much better movie or as equal to a lot of these more current films just because of how bad they are and how reasonably like they are just not holding a candle to tell as equal if not better story than this movie does. So going into this movie, it's very rough special effects wise, but it's overall just a rough movie. Just because reasonably it spends time on stupid stuff and it doesn't have a good enough villain, and it just reasonably is a movie that is kind of a cash grab, because at that time you couldn't avoid seeing an ad for this movie somewhere. And so I think people were really starting to get the buzz fully going on this movie that really didn't have a good enough anything going into it. It didn't have a good enough budget, didn't have a good enough approach, uh, didn't really stick the landing when it comes to what people were diehard Green Lanterns were wanting a movie to be, which was probably 80% OA and 20% all the other crap that Hal would normally do. But instead, it's probably 60% crap that Hal would normally do, and 40% OA and fighting a guy. So yeah. So let's go into spoilers about this movie, because at the end of the day, um, looking back on it, like, I would probably say reasonably, when looking at the more current films like the Dark Knights and the Man of Steel and probably even Wonder Woman, uh, barely Aquaman, and severely barely Shazam, because Shazam was just a movie just to tell jokes. Didn't make sense. Uh, Looking at Green Lantern, I think Green Lantern is equally as good as the story as Shazam, because Shazam doesn't really have a real villain. Shazam is just a movie to tell jokes, which is kind of the same as Green Lantern, and reasonably Shazam is just a story to showcase this guy's powers for a very long-winded amount of time, and to ultimately Hal is just a character that is really just eventually going to become Green Lantern and eventually go into OA. So Shazam, Green Lantern, equally as good, but not really all that great when it comes down to it. Either one. And I know people might have higher expectations for Shazam or this and that, but when looking at it, that's how I feel. Ultimately, when looking at it, I think Birds of Prey wasn't that. There was a lot of DC movies that weren't that good. So when looking at it, I think Green Lantern is actually pretty good movie compared to some of the awful things that eventually came down the pipeline. So spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this movie. So the very first 30 minutes, let's get this out of the way. Let's shove this all out of the way. 30 minutes of all kid sequences. We either have young Hal Jordan going and seeing his dad, and ultimately going to his dad, finding out that he has to do one last flight because it's going to be his last. And so immediately, once finding this out, young Hal is asking his dad, well, are you scared? And he's like, well, it's my job not to be. Hence, we throw that into the later part of the movie, because again, this is his great power, great responsibility line. So, immediately we go into, because I'm going to rush through the very beginning of this movie, because I hate the beginning of this movie, because it's so drawn out. It's like you have to go through every flipping of the switch to make sure that are you sure that his dad is going to die in this movie? Yeah. we've checked 85 different things to make sure before his dad is going to die. Okay, he's going to die now. Great. So eventually we have it to where the guy takes off on the plane, then eventually crashes the plane. Young Hal is running to the plane, and the guy's getting out of the plane is like, hey, yeah, I made it, and then blow. And then Hal gets thrusted away from the plane, and his dad's dead. boo freaking who cares, because ultimately it's I don't care for this scene. Like, it's so drawn out and it's so boring, and they should have had this as like a quick, very quick scene, because I don't understand the trauma that builds over time of this thing, and how basically when Hal is looking at a picture of his father, all of a sudden, oh my god, whoa, wow, just wow. So in other words, this guy could not have a picture of his father, and he probably would not crash motorcycles and planes and all these other things that they tell that he had crashed a motorcycle and plane or whatever. Or maybe this guy should not be flying and or doing a boatload of any of these things anymore, because knowing full well he's going to crash them. So maybe he should retire from flying planes. Maybe immediately once this crash thing happens with his jet, he should retire. Because he's like, dude, like, this keeps happening and I keep letting it happen. And I'm crashing all these motorcycles and planes and whatever. And good for me that I'm doing all these things, I guess. So we ultimately have Hal waking up after his father is dead sequence, to do, of course, the classic hey guys, I'm late. Ultimately going into his job, to where his longtime friend slash coworker slash boss slash any other thing, Blake Lively, is telling him, hey, like, you're late. Like, I was late when I was like 2, and then I wasn't late anymore. So, like, she was late coming out of the bun of the oven or something. I don't know. It was some stupid thing. Like, she was like, yeah, I was late, and then I turned 4. I'm like, good for you. So, a stupid little thing that they have there. So she ends up like berating him, of course, like any boss would do. And she's like, well, yeah, like, Volt, she's like mentioning that she was throwing some hat into the name of just, yeah, we could have gotten so and so person. And Ryan Reynolds is going, yeah, well, that guy's too busy not being good enough. So immediately, Ryan is going on to this scenario of testing these jets, these robotic jets. And so eventually they're doing this whole showcasing. And so supposedly Ryan takes it upon himself to, like, ultimately there was a fight out between these robotic jets. And so instead of just showcasing these things off and losing, he desperately wants to find a way to win. So immediately he craters his own plane. He freaking flies up to where he cannot fly, and to ultimately, like, uh, have his plane stop working, to have these robotic planes also stop working. And because ultimately he had used Starfire as a decoy for her to get killed, so way he can go and um, try and kill one of the robotic jets, but it doesn't quite work that way. So anyways, he quitters his own plane, shoots them down, and wins. And so immediately, everybody's going to lose money off this contract, because it's like, dude, the humans still beat the robots. And so people are starting to get fired. One of the guys that is irrelevant but absolutely needs to be relevant because the story is going to tie him back into later, is ultimately telling Ryan to look over his shoulder, uh, or for him to, like, watch his back. Ryan, of course, does a stupid joke of like, well, yeah, that's physically impossible. So the one guy is going to get fired, and a lot of people are going to lose their jobs. But ultimately, Blake Lively is just saying, hey, like, hey, everything's still good. We're still going to get this contract eventually. Like, she's asking, like, Ryan, like, what happened, during the flight, and she's trying to investigate what happens with the plane. So eventually, we get it to where Ryan is heading to this birthday party, and ultimately they displayed on the news because everybody just displays all the time on every news that somebody uh, crashes a jet. It's always displayed on the news all the time, everywhere. Whenever somebody crashes a jet anywhere, like immediately the news has the coverage. So basically, the people at the party saw this news report and ultimately are telling Ryan once he arrives to said birthday party, hey, like, it's like, are you wanting to be just like your father, that you have to die like him too, and blah blah blah, stupid garbage. It's like, you know what? Yeah, like Ryan goes in there and he's like, you know what? I love coming to these parties, and so immediately he tries to find the one kid that has the birthday party, and the birthday party kid is hiding in his room, all sulky because he's like, you know what? Like, I didn't want Green Lantern to die. And so basically, we have the whole trope um, of Ryan's character talking, or Hal's character talking about how bad this party is. There's no dancers, there's no ladies. So eventually, he gives the kid a birthday present, and the kid's all sad because he's like, I thought you were gonna die. I thought you were gonna crash. And he's like, aren't you afraid? And like immediately the Ryan throwing the line back of like, I'm like, it's my job not to be afraid. So the kid gets some fighter jet that ultimately was kind of a reused gift from Hal, because ultimately he had gotten it from his father. So it's a reused gift. So eventually, now we get into the freaking Green Lantern part, which is like, thank God, I'm like 30 minutes in, and I'm like, when are we gonna start getting this Green Lantern part? Because I'm like, good God, like I didn't realize like this took 30 minutes to get to this point. So Hal goes back into his car and immediately gets Green gooped into fighting into finding Abensor. Like he gets into this green circular like sphere and gets pushed into Abensor's spacecraft, because what happens is Abensor ends up is all flying around, because in the very beginning of this movie, we have two astronauts that stupidly unlock parallax. Alien astronauts that we don't know who they are, unlocking parallax from some dimension, giving them their fear, and ultimately he gets unlocked by that. Ultimately, parallax ends up going for Abensor, because Abensor is getting reports of planets getting destroyed and everything like that, and certain lanterns are going missing. So Abensor is talking to Sinestro, and it seems like they're really good friends, and blah 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 blah. So it's just blah 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 about this movie. It's a lot of blah blah blah. I hate the first 30 minutes of this film. So basically, we have Abensor who talks to Sinestro about all this crap, and then eventually Avensor on his ship, ultimately, he notices that the parallax is going to attack his ship, and then eventually parallax gets to Avensor, so Avensor has to then get into some uh, escape pod of his ship, because he couldn't just fly away because he's a Green Lantern. But he's like, well, yeah, like I'm weakened, like I'm hurt, and so ultimately he sends one last transmission to Sinestro and tells him, like, tell the Guardians it's parallax, and so he gets shipped off to find his next ring wielder, and that ring wielder ends up being Hal. So the ring ends up finding Hal to ultimately find Avensor. Immediately, Hal rushes into try to get Abensor out of his ship, but there's nothing that Hal can do because ultimately he doesn't know how to help him because the planet doesn't have purple blood. So immediately, Abensor is telling Hal that he is the ring bearer. It's like, get the lantern, put the ring on it, speak the oath, blah, blah, blah. And he's like, oh, yeah, sure, whatever you want, Hal. Whatever you want, guy. Whatever you want. So Abensor passes away. Hal buries Abensor, and so eventually Hal calls his best friend, and then eventually police arrive. So Hal starts explaining this all to his best friend, and ultimately his best friend doesn't believe him because, like, dude, like, there's no way that you can be the perfect person for this. It's like, if anything, maybe on his planet, maybe hero means a-hole or something like that. Asshole. So we ultimately have it to where Hal is trying to repetitively try to speak the oath. He's trying to, like, point the ring at the lantern to try to see what it does, and immediately he is consistently trying to figure out what the F is going on with this thing, and how to speak the oath. So eventually he actually touches the ring to the lantern and then speaks the oath. Cue Blake Lively knocking at his door and telling him, "Hey, how's it going? Like, hey, I've been mulling over some things," and she's like, "Hey, can I come in?" And he's like, "No, you can't come in, but hey, can we go to a bar and get drinks?" And ultimately she says, "Well, yeah," and he's like, "Yeah, let's go and get drinks." So pushing her to go and get drinks. So they talk it out, and reasonably they're talking about old times. They're talking about the first time they flew and all this and that, talking about good old times. And eventually Blake Lively's character is eventually coming to a consensus of eventually coming to the point of she wanted to get all this out of the way to eventually then talk about the real reason why she's there, is that there was nothing wrong with this plane, and what's wrong with Hal. Is there something wrong, Hal? What's going on? What's going on with your life? You gonna be a space cop? Or what? Like, they don't get to that point, but I just want to throw that joke out there. So basically, like, Hal doesn't want to hear any of this. Like, they go and they have a dance and whatever, and because he has to keep singing this dum 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 dum, and I'm just like, God, we should be at Oa at this point in this movie. We should be at Oa now. Avensor, Ryan or Hal got the ring, so now we should be in Oa. We shouldn't be dum 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 dum. Why the are we singing this song now and dancing with Blake Lively? Why are we doing this? Even though it's a good romantic part, still I don't understand why we're doing this. So eventually, all the while this is going on, and we're gonna get to a transitional point here in a minute. So basically we get to the aspect of okay, like we get through this moment of eventually Ryan eventually kind of getting like, I don't want to talk to Blake's character about this, like, I'm done, like, I'm just gonna, like, kind of back and forth, like, he's talking to her about, like, how, like, he hates that she's in, like, suits, and that she always just wanted to be like a fighter pilot, and now she's working in the business and she actually likes doing both, and like throwing that in her face a lot. And so immediately he just walk away into a fight with a couple other guys, and to where eventually, of course, he's outnumbered, and so because they want to getting back at him for losing their job, so they're going to beat the crap out of him. But he ends up turning on his Green Lantern power and punching them all with a big fist, knocking them all out. And eventually he gets shot out to Oa. So, transitional moment. So, we ultimately have Hector. Hector. Why? But Hector. Hector. Hector very much is a very smart kid that never really wanted to go out in the world and experience life. He's not a doer. He's not a doer. He's a thinker. So, anyways, we have this guy that otherwise is Tim Robbins' son, and so basically this guy gets called up with black suits coming to him and saying, "Hey, we're gonna take you. We're gonna put this blindfold over you, and you're gonna go to this facility." He's going to this facility to dissect this Abensor because immediately he is the best candidate for this. So immediately he's going to dissect Abensor, and eventually while dissecting him, he's getting a little bit of parallax from Abensor's body. And so he is all of a sudden starting to realize that he had been infected by parallax. So, after dissecting Abensor. So, basically, we get it to where, because I'm gonna kind of transition to this, like we're gonna spend a lot of time on Hector, but then get back to how once we get to the Oa parts, because reasonable reasons. So Hector eventually gets into the parallax infection, and eventually he starts to wail and scream at night, and eventually loses sleep and whatever. But eventually, once he wakes up and starts a class, all of a sudden he is starting to hear things from his students, basically calling him a loser or a freak or whatever. And the teacher picks up on all this and is like, "What did you just call me, student? You call me a freak?" And then all of a sudden the student is like, "Oh my god, he picked up on all this." And then eventually it gets to the point to where Hector uses his power and flies the student over and knocks him out. So it eventually gets to the point to where weird things are happening in Hector's class. And so eventually Hector tries to take some of his blood and figure out what's going on, figures out that he's getting infected by parallax. Eventually, Hector eventually finds out that Tim Robbins' character, the guy that is his father, ultimately was the person that sent him out on that mission because he was part of a board committee, to get him to dissect this alien. And ultimately, he was like, his father was telling him that this is his big shot, his big opportunity. And really Hector was thinking, like, you know what, there probably was a lot more people that were well off, that were much better at this or were much more qualified than this. And it's like, well, Hector's father goes, it's like, well, yeah, but they weren't as connected. Like, if anything, like, and he was immediately in his mind thinking that Hector is like throwing this great opportunity away, to because he's thrown his entire life away. So, because eventually, once, like, the funny thing that I saw is when Tim Robbins and Hector go into the room together to talk about this whole thing. Like, eventually, Hector's father is realizing that he's lost some sleep. He's like, "Hey, you look a little worn down." It's like, little hair of the dog. It's like, what was that girl's name, son? And Hector's like, ha ha ha. I was like, yeah. I was like you need to get some sleep, son. So that was kind of a funny little joke. But eventually, like going into this whole uh, they're just two guys always at odds with one another. Um, even when at some points it seems like the father is trying to have his best interests at heart, really a lot of times he like needs to forcibly like live up to something, and if Hector isn't going to do that, then his father is gonna consistently berate him and hate him and just this and that. So eventually it gets to the point to where Hector is to the point to where eventually Hector is using this power so consistently and like reading everyone's mind. Eventually, they go to some party and eventually can start like reading people's minds at the party. So cue us getting back to that party with Hal. So Hal is on Oa. Hal is getting like poked and prodded, and ultimately he is very much getting to him finding out that he's Hal Jordan from Sector 2814. I know that because I've seen so many comic books, I've read so many comic books and read so many freaking cartoons and everything like that, knowing like Hal is, of course, from Sector 2814, and then eventually it gets to the point to where there is like multiple different Green Lanterns on Earth, so it ends up being that they end up being like, I think Guy Gardner, I think is 2814.1, and I think like John Stewart is like 28.14.2 or something like that, and or something it gets to that point. I think Kyle. God, where does Kyle come in? I don't remember which number is which now. Crap. It could be that Guy could be 2.14.1, and then Kyle could be point 0.2. I don't know. I don't remember. It's a little bit difficult. And really, who cares? But it ends up being what it is. So, anyways, mood point. Hal is ultimately waking up after being poked and prodded and being tested um, by this medical synopsis to give him his Green Lantern suit for the first time. So we see the Green Lantern suit. He is admiring himself in a reflection, and ultimately meets one of his Green Lanterns from an adjacent sector. Eventually mentioning to him, like, yeah, all of a sudden I realized, yeah, insufficient storage. I was like, what the heck's going on? So I had to make some adjustments. I had to find out, okay, I must have not remembered to delete some things, and that's what I did. And so supposedly we're fine, I guess. We'll figure that out when I have to do stuff at the end of the day. So, anyways, where I was at. So Hal is ultimately getting the walkthrough of Oa with Hal ultimately telling him that they need to fly, that they need to we have this fish-like guy that is telling Hal like, okay, like how constructs work and how to manipulate things, and eventually kind of having him go to a meeting where they ultimately see all the Green Lanterns and ultimately talk to or have Sinestro have a meeting and ultimately have him talk about how they've lost so many people, and then eventually he is at some point they need to remind it about who they are, or we are the core. Yeah, whoop de doo. Yeah, it's like, what was the point of all this? What is the point of what was? Anyway, so Eventually, we have it to where the fish guy is ultimately telling him about constructs, and then eventually, um, the we find out that the ring is telling Hal that he is having an imminent threat come soon, which ultimately that imminent threat is Kilowog. Ultimately, for like a barely brief question, a very brief section of this thing, which ultimately irritates the crap out of me to this day. Because ultimately, towards the end of the movie, where we reconfirm what we say here. So we have Kilowog ultimately training Hal Jordan, and I say training in an aggravated way because this is like barely training and doing anything. Kilowog is ultimately making, ultimately showcasing how to use his constructs, ultimately telling him his constructs is weak, and because he's feeble minded and stuff along those lines. And so eventually he is putting a rock on top of Hal, and Hal puts this wall in on top of him, so like holds the rock. And so Kilowog puts another rock on there, and Hal puts um, kind of things to be in place to keep the wall much more construct and whatever. Makes it like a table to kind of keep the weight, but eventually the rocks fall, and so eventually uh, we have the second portion of Kilowog making a construct of the sun, to where ultimately Hal has to tether himself to the ground, to where the sun is sucking him in, to where Kilowog is telling him like, the bigger that you are, the faster you burn. And so eventually it's to the point to where this scenario is over because Sinestro pops in for good old little jaunt, ultimately telling Hal that he will never be as good as Abensor. That ultimately that that he isn't thinking fast enough, because ultimately they go into a fight with one another, and ultimately Sinestro starts dual wielding him with swords, ultimately going at him with swords. Eventually, they have this whole transgression going on, to where eventually Hal constructs a chainsaw, and eventually Sinestro makes a shield, and eventually, Hal is thrown to a brick wall. Hal falls on the brick wall. There's this back and forth exchange, and it's actually probably the best thing going on in this movie because it's the most interesting constructs that are being put together. But eventually, with multiple swords being put up against Hal, eventually Hal is not strong enough to construct a good enough construct to fight Sinestro, because his brain is feeble, and his constructs are weak, and blah blah blah. So we eventually get to the aspect of Sinestro at some point talking to the Guardians, pushing us forward, because ultimately Hal is like, you know what, like, I am not good enough to fight Sinestro, and you know what, I don't think I am a good enough Lantern. So ultimately he decides to quit. He decides to quit and leave Oa. He decides to ultimately go to a party and this and that. So Sinestro is getting alerted via the Guardians that they've lost so many Green Lanterns, and so he decides to uh, renew the faith of the Guardians of the Green Lantern Corps to send him and a bunch of other Green Lanterns, any number of strong members, to go up against Parallax. Eventually, they try to fight this thing, but eventually they end up dead as well, to where leaving Sinestro left alive. And of course, because you kind of have to. So, because they ultimately chain up Parallax onto this planet, but it doesn't really quite work out. Eventually, Parallax decks them all and kills them, except for Sinestro. So, we have Hal at this party, and eventually he is meeting up with Hector's father and basically telling him, it's like, well, hey, like, if anything, it's good that you're a doer, because you know what? There's some people that are thinkers, but hey, you're a doer, and if anything, it's good to see you doing things. And like Hal comes back with the whole like, well, like if there wouldn't have been a fighter jet for me to fly it, there had to been somebody that thought that up. It's like, so it's like, if anything, it's like the thinkers. If there weren't thinkers, I wouldn't be able to do anything. And like everybody's just like polishing their own egos and everything like that. They're just like, yeah, like you're making me feel good, so I need to in turn make you feel good. Oh, good for us that we're making each other feel good. We're polishing each other's swords. Isn't that great? So Hector kind of eventually meets with Hal, and he's like, hey, buddy. Like, yeah, like my father says, not a doer, but like whatever. It's like it's good to see you again, Hal. Yeah, it is good to see you again, Hector. So eventually, Hector eventually goes into re-meeting up with Blake Lively's character, and eventually, like, of course, wants to see her again, because ultimately, like, coming up with an old flame of a girl that he had long lost. And ultimately, he thinks that if he tells her that he had dissected an alien, maybe that will win her over. And plus, Hector is also just kind of ticked off of being around his father, and his father like not telling him again that he isn't quite living up to his father's legacy, and ba 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 ba. So eventually, Hector's father is like trying to jump into this conversation, because told me say that's like, oh well, like, is he telling you again one of his science fiction stories, and this and that, and he's like trying to like, and in his mind, Hector's father is telling him, it's like, God, he's blowing it again, like he's freaking ruining it, he's doing something dumb. So eventually Hector just leaves this party, or is going to leave this party. And so eventually Tim Robbins is eventually going to do this speech, because here's the juncture. Eventually, this whole entire party was because Blake Lively and her father had gotten this contract back on track, so that's why they have this whole entire party. That's how they begin, with some band singing I'm gone," and then what was the point of this entire band? There's no point of this band, just for a guy to sing I'm gone," and then the band's gone. So recently they have this speech going on where the father is like, yeah, hey, yeah, we won this contract, good for us, so let's bring up my daughter, because reasonably she's the entire reason for why we won this contract back. And so immediately she goes up there and she's like, well, hey, like, this is great and everything like that, but let's also get Tim Robbins up there. And so immediately Tim Robbins goes in up there, and immediately he says like, yeah, it's great to see this next generation of people that are really stepping up and really like leaving our companies in good hands. We have Blake Lively's character um, that's really successful, and we have Hal Jordan that's a spinning image of his father, and blah 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 blah. So, and of course Hector was left out of this whole thing, because of course he would be when his father is not even talking about him, even though he knows that Hector is still there. So they finish up this speech, and eventually, Tim Robbins' character is to just go off on a helicopter. And so Hector is so just miserable that his father didn't mention him into his speech. So when the helicopter is taking off, Hector uses his power to create some kind of helicopter crash, to where ultimately the helicopter is flying all through this entire area uncontrolled. And so eventually, realizing that this helicopter is going through everywhere, Hal Jordan is now Green Lantern, to eventually uh, make the helicopter into a car and then have this car like seemingly go round and round through all of these Hot Wheel like tracks. And so then eventually to at some point get this car to eventually get this helicopter car to stop. And eventually all the while eventually this helicopter goes into creating a accident that almost kills Blake Lively's character. Ryan also says that as well. So eventually, then rescuing Blake Lively, hugging her, and then eventually Blake Lively's father goes into like hugging Blake Lively, and then Ryan goes to fly off. And then eventually we get to the point to where uh, Ryan Reynolds' or Ryan Reynolds' best friend ultimately comes in and says, "Hey, like you owe me. Like you need to tell me. You need to tell me. Like, hey, like what you did. Like what's going on. Like you owe me. And so you need to show it to me and everything like that." So that's when Ryan ultimately is going to show him the suit, but realizes that the ring isn't charged, recharges the ring, and then eventually shows him the suit, and he's like, "Oh my God, Green!" And so eventually he tells him, it's like, don't the guys get the girls? So immediately Hal Jordan, aka Green Lantern, is going into Blake Lively's uh, office, workplace, and eventually, so he's eventually going there, and Blake Lively's character is thanking him for saving his life, or saving her life, and immediately he's like, "Well, no problem, ma'am." Like he's trying to do a different voice and sound different, but then eventually, the longer that Blake Lively gets closer to Hal, she eventually is like, "Oh my God, Hal!" And he's like, "No, I'm not Hal." Like, so immediately he has to break character and say that yeah, he is Hal, and she's like, "Oh my God!" Like, of course it's Hal. Like, wouldn't like of course it's you. It's like she's basically seen him naked, so like him hiding his cheekbones, like it's not like she wouldn't be able to tell it's Hal. So eventually he tells her the entire truth that basically what had happened, and now he's a space cop, and this and that, and basically she's like, well, like who would have expected you to end up being the space cop? Who would have known? And he's like, no, I picked it right away. I picked it for so long. And so immediately he is giving her a birthday present, because ultimately it's her birthday. So he made a construct of a green necklace to give to her. And so eventually so basically she's like asking him, it's like, well, hey, well then what's your next thing? What is the next thing you're gonna do? And he's immediately just like, yeah, let's not really talk about that, because I think I'm done. I think I'm done with being a Green Lantern. And she's like, what? Like, dude, like people have given you so many things so often, and like you're throwing them all away, and you're throwing this away. Like this is like a big thing, and you're throwing it all away. So immediately Blake Lively kind of like is tired of of Hal, so eventually she just kind of goes away. So eventually we queue up to where ultimately Sinestro is ultimately asking about, because immediately he is defeated by Parallax, so eventually he goes to the Guardians and ultimately tells him about the big old L that he got served up. So ultimately they're telling, the Guardians are finally telling Sinestro about Parallax, and they're telling that one of the Guardians ended up going and trying to want to wield the power of fear, and eventually uh, none of them wanted to do it, but this Guardian did, and then eventually this power was all consuming and turned him into Parallax. So eventually they are starting to decide, you know what, like maybe Will is not a powerful enough source, then maybe we have to wield the power of fear. So reasonably, we get it to where, okay, Hal eventually is going to come back and going to mention, hey, don't wield the power of fear. Like, if anything, like let me defend my planet. Because eventually, Hal gets it to him getting a notification on his ring that there is a problem afoot, because Hector eventually is having his face and body all warped, and so eventually he's going and very much uh, like his power is starting to take over. It's starting to be all consuming, but he's never felt better. So eventually we get to the uh, the woman that brought him in to dissect Abensor. She eventually is there to collect him and realizing how bad off he is, and then eventually they found out that he had been infected with Parallax. So they bring him into the science lab, and then eventually uh, they're going to put him to sleep. They're going to keep him sedated, and then maybe either dissect him or whatever, but it never gets to that point. So Hector eventually gets to be seen by his father, and he's like, "Oh my god! Like we're gonna figure out a cure for you, son. We're gonna protect you. We're gonna." And he's like, "Wow!" It's like, "Well, now you're actually caring about me now, Dad. You're actually giving a now, Dad." So eventually, he's telling him that he's never felt better, and like ultimately they're just gonna strap him onto a table and sedate him a lot. So eventually it gets to the point to where ultimately the guy is on this table strapped down, and to ultimately he starts using his powers. Starts ultimately he had touched the girl that had Amanda Waller. He had touched her and read all of her memories, and so eventually we get to the aspect of, okay, now Hector is starting to use his powers, and eventually he is starting to kill some folks. And so basically, he is telling Amanda Waller and he's telling his father to run. They start to run. Eventually, um, Hal appears to eventually start to uh, trying to defend some of these people. Ultimately, we have Amanda Waller that smashes into this glass. Hal constructs some water for her to fall on and for her to be okay. And Hector's father eventually goes into being uh, kind of put through the flames at some point, but before that, uh, some of the flames are being put onto Hal, and so uh, Hal pushes those to be thrusted onto Hector, and because Hector's father is on the bed, and that Hector was in, because ultimately Hector is going to torture his father at some point. So eventually, with all these like flying like helium looking tanks attacking Hal, he's ricocheting them back. Eventually he gets knocked down to where eventually Hector goes over to Hal and drops, ultimately touching Green Lantern, and ultimately like going, hey, like Hal, like that's you, like you're one of them, like how is it that we came out so different, hmm? And then eventually, um, Hector keeps like hurting Hal, and to where the point to where eventually Hector's master plan is to eventually just, of course, kill Hal, but eventually that doesn't work quite that way. So eventually, Hector has, or Hal has to watch Hector's father being killed and burnt alive, and so then Hal eventually goes and uh, tries to defeat Hector, but it doesn't really quite work out that well. So eventually, we juxtaposition to again uh, get it to where pushing this movie forward to now having Parallax seemingly start to make its way to Earth, and because reasonably when Hal was with Hector and they were having this like heart to heart, close together moment. Eventually, Hal puts his ring up to Hector, and eventually he starts seeing Parallax, and Parallax is telling him how he's undefeated, undefeatable, how he's gonna take him and kill him and crush him and whatever, all the villainous things that they would ever say, like I am just unbeatable, blah blah blah, the garbage. So eventually, Hal shoots Hector with his ring and then takes care of him for the meantime, and so we push to eventually how uh, Hal having to be pushed to, after hearing all this stuff in the news about the guy dying and whatever. Blake Lively and his best friend kind of go to his aid and kind of just tell him, it's like, hey, well, why aren't you doing something? Like, you have this ring, and why aren't you doing it? Because he ultimately breaks down and he says, because I'm afraid. Afraid. Like, yeah, and ultimately Blake Lively is telling him, it's like, well, yeah, I'm sure your father was afraid, but that didn't stop him. Like, he ultimately had enough, like he realized that he should have the courage to stand up and fight and whatever. So pushes with hearing all this stuff that Blake Lively is telling him to, like, hey, you have to just like, you have to know, like, everyone on Earth is going to die if you don't step to it. So you need to save this planet. You need to save all of us. And so immediately Hal goes to Sinestro and basically tells him, hey, don't wield the yellow ring. Don't yield to fear. It's like, if anything, like, we as a planet, we tell people that we're only human uh because that's who we are. We're only human. Like, we realize how much limits we have on ourselves. So like, if anything, don't give in to fear. It's like, let me try and save my planet. Let me let me try this. It's like, if anything, like, let me save my Earth. Let me save my planet. And and Sinestro's just like, well, like, you could die, and Hal's just like, well, then I die. So what? It's like just let me do this. Uh, it's like if anything, you guys can do whatever you want after if I don't do this. But if I do this, and I do win this, then like come on, like give me this shot. And so that's when Sinestro is finally like, you know what, Hal Jordan, like good on you, like good for you, good for you that you're gonna be a new person now and that you've changed. And so we get into the aspect of that Hector is going to, or Hal is going to confront Hector. And immediately we find out that when Hal is confronting Hector, ultimately he has Blake Lively. He has Blake Lively, and he's has a yellow needle to her. And so basically, he is trying to trade the ring for Blake Lively's character. And so, you know how this kind of exchange goes if you've seen this movie. Eventually, Hal gives up the ring to Hector, and then basically, uh, Hector is still going to do whatever he wants regardless. And ultimately, because Hector is saying, "Look at you." It's like, "Look how like great you look and whatever. Look how great you are and whatever." And so ultimately, Hal tells him, "It's like, well, hey, if you have this ring, you can be anything. You can look like anything. It doesn't like." And ultimately, like, let her decide after you become the Green Lantern, like who she really wants. And so immediately he puts on the ring, and then Hector said, "You know what? I lied about everything. Like I lied." Like ultimately I'm just gonna have this power ring, and now I'm just gonna kill everybody and take whatever I want. And ultimately Hal ultimately says like, well, I lied too. The ring doesn't work that way. You have to be chosen. And so immediately the ring comes back and hits Hal, knocks him out. Eventually Parallax comes to Earth and eventually sucks the yellow out of Hector because he's failed too often. And so then Hal eventually has to scramble to try to get the ring, but Parallax is trying to suck the yellow out of him as well. And so Blake Lively ends up shooting some rocket like things into Parallax, getting it to where it breaks Hal free. So eventually, it just becomes this fight out between Hal and Parallax, because Parallax eventually just starts running the town rampant, and so Blake Lively is asking Hal what is he gonna do, and immediately he's like, well, maybe I can outsmart it. Maybe I can just figure out some way, kind of like the dog fight between the robotic planes. I can figure out a way how to just outmaneuver and just outsmart this thing. So basically we have a very interesting like scene going on where Hal is in town and just using all of these like these are some awesome sequences of Hal trying to use his power against Parallax. And this is probably the best moments of this entire film, bar none, of like Hal using his powers and trying to very much like create this big huge gun to kind of shoot against Parallax. Ultimately, there's civilians that are starting to get like uh, like almost nabbed up by Parallax. So Hal is trying to grab some civilians out of the way, trying to snatch some civilians to save them. and this and that, told me where someone's thanking Hal, and he's like, get out of my way. It's like, to where ultimately, at some point, like, he's throwing like a gas, uh, a gasoline semi truck thing at Parallax and exploding it, and to try to. It's a very interesting sequence to eventually, to again, Parallax becomes too much. He becomes all consuming and is pushing up against Hal, and Hal has a shield around him. And Parallax is telling him, "It's like, dude, I am Neville. I'm inevitable. I'm gonna beat you. I'm gonna crush you. Like once I consume you and kill you, like I'm gonna take everything that you love and this and that." And while this guy is saying all this blibbity bloop, we ultimately have Hal, while he's saying this, is of course saying the Green Lantern oath, which of course is again best scene of this movie. All this rigmarole of all this fighting going on in this town, every single thing is probably the best scene going on in this movie. And of course, while this guy is ribbing him and giving him all this crap, Hal, of course, is speaking the Green Lantern oath. And brightest day and blackest night, let no evil escape my sight. Uh, those who worship evil's might beware my power, Green Lantern's light. And bam, freaking hits him with the light. So eventually, we get it to where Hal had figured it out. The sun. So reasonably, he took what Kilowog had told him, and so eventually he is taking, because ultimately he's trying to get Parallax away from all the civilians, and so he's kind of getting him up there, but then eventually he's realizing that, oh, the sun. So eventually, Hal is making Parallax follow him to the sun, and so eventually he is getting him towards the sun, and then basically with dual flyer jets like flying away from him, flying around him. And so eventually, since Parallax is so close to the sun, eventually, so now Hal has this moment of really just slowly just throwing off his shoulder holder things, and Parallax is just like, yeah, like I'm gonna take you down. And then Hal basically has one gigantic construct of a fist to punch Parallax in the face and pushing Parallax into the sun. And of course, that is where Hal basically defeats Parallax and then almost gets sucked into the sun, to where Sinestro, Kilowog, and the other Green Lantern ultimately ropes Hal back in to ultimately just kind of pat him on the shoulder and say, hey man, you did it. You beat him. Good for you. And so immediately that is the kind of overall like huzzah, like ultimately like we have Sinestro that is having the meeting again, telling how like great Hal is and how basically Abensor had found a perfect match of a guy that is just like Abensor. And so immediately they're all excited because they're just like, yeah, we did it. Hal did, but frickin' we did it technically, because if one lantern wins, I guess everybody wins. So immediately we have Hal that is back on planet Earth talking to Blake Lively, and it's like, well, hey, what's the thing you got next up? You gonna go downtown Milky Way to save a cat from a tree or something like that? He's like, well, no. Like, if anything, my what I do will take me to places, but not far. But yeah, but I gotta leave. I gotta leave. The Green Lanterns want me to do some things, and so eventually he is flying off. All the while, eventually we have in some scene, some scenario where Sinestro is taking off his green ring to ultimately still put on a fear ring, and so we can figure out where this is going, huh? So yeah, basically a movie that kind of holds up there or doesn't really hold up. Isn't really that good, but there are some good scenes into it. There's some interesting parts of it. Basically, it's like who cares about the first hour? Let's get into Hal Jordan being on Oa, and after that, that's when the actual movie gets actually quasi decent at some points, and to where there is an interesting thing amount of things going on. Um, I just think overall, like there's a lot about this movie that wasn't like there's a lot of problems with this movie. It probably didn't have much to do with like I ultimately think of this as just like I don't think Ryan Reynolds was a good fit for this movie because I think Ryan Reynolds tells jokes and I don't think that this movie was for a comedian actor. But I think overall this movie just wasn't working out for any number of reasons beyond just who was casted in this movie, who was directing this movie. It was more beyond that of just like the story was awful, the the story was awful, the budget of this movie was awful, and probably no one really cared about this movie because that kind of really goes into a number of other DC films that I would ultimately just say like none of them care. They just all wanted to make money off of this thing because slap a logo on something and immediately people go into it. Um, Again, I kind of go back and forth about this movie on if it's good or not, even still watching it again now. Uh, Again, I still feel that this movie is severely rough, but looking at it, the best parts are just when Hal gets to Oa, and even though the computer graphics on it aren't all that good, it's still just like once we get to that fight out and when Hal fights Parallax, even though again when it's just uh still still a quasi decent movie when we have the real fight out scenes and everything like that. Kind of makes up for a lot of the garbage that you have to sift through and a lot of the character building that we have to kind of sift through. So I don't want to make this too long, so I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.